Hi, everybody. Tonight, I invite you to settle into the folds of your blanket. Feel the quiet hum of the world slow to a whisper, and prepare to drift gently into the realm of shadows and secrets. What you are about to hear is a journey through the soft echoes of a time both forgotten and strangely remembered. A tale woven through cobbled streets, candlelit chambers, and the silent sternness of old stone walls. This is not a tale of kings or heroes, but of rules and reckonings, and of the most peculiar punishments ever devised by human hands in the long, dim corridors of medieval justice. Our story begins not with a single man or moment, but with the mood of an age. Imagine, if you will, the air in the village square, thick with the scent of tallow smoke, horse sweat, and earth just after rain. A slow bell tolls noon. People drift like leaves into the open space between chapel and market. There is no grand spectacle today, only a quiet, morbid curiosity. For in the Middle Ages, punishment was not merely correction. It was theater, it was instruction, and at times it was an art. The peculiarities of justice were born from a deep fear of sin, chaos, and the invisible forces believed to swirl around everyday life. The rules were not just to keep peace, but to keep the world in balance, to prevent rot from spreading from one soul to the next. Thus, punishments were as much a public ritual as a personal reckoning. They were strange, harsh, and unforgettable. Let us wander first to a modest village tucked beneath the crags of what is now southern Germany. It is the year of our Lord 1274. There, in the heart of a meadow beyond the farrier's shop, stands a wooden frame unlike any you've likely seen. It is not a gallows. No, it is known as the shame flute, or Schandflöte. It resembles a recorder or long wooden pipe, but made cruelly of iron. Those who dared insult the sacred craft of music, bad players, poor singers, discordant performers, were sentenced to wear this device chained to their necks, fingers locked into place as if still holding the instrument. They were led through the streets, mocked not for their criminality, but their cacophony. The villagers called out, some in jest, others in scorn. The offender, often a weary traveling minstrel or drunk local, would stumble, trying to balance the awkward metal weight, unable to explain themselves over the crowd's laughter. But behind that mockery, there was always a deeper message. Even joy, even music, must follow the rules. The shame flute was part of a wide family of humiliation punishments. These were not designed to break bones, but to bruise pride and ego. A man who overdrank might be forced to carry a large wooden barrel around his body, head, and limbs, poking through holes cut for arms and legs, turning him into a walking cask. They called it the drunkard's cloak. In the colder months, it was a chilly burden. In warmer seasons, it reeked of sweat and mildew and old ale. To the medieval mind, these punishments were not merely creative. They were moral lessons in living flesh. A woman who gossiped too freely might find herself wearing the scold's bridle, a horrific metal mask with a bar that pressed against her tongue, rendering her silent while others jeered. Speech, you see, was sacred and dangerous. To misuse it was to disturb the delicate harmony of a community. A town was like a song, and every voice had its place. Dissonance had to be silenced. Punishments could also involve deeply symbolic acts. Take, for instance, the curious fate of those accused of stealing bread. Rather than mere whipping or imprisonment, some towns favored what they called the bread march. The thief, head shaved to mark shame, would carry an enormous loaf, far larger than practical, strapped to their back or balanced on their head, walking from bakery to bakery to apologize. It was humiliation baked in wheat, a burden of carbs and conscience. Not all punishments, however, were so mild. Some bore an edge of madness, conjured from the deepest fears of the time. In certain corners of France, there existed the cat burning, a bizarre punishment wherein accused witches or blasphemers were made to wear sacks of live cats tied around their necks. The claws and howls, the helpless terror, were believed to purge evil from the soul. These were not the acts of cruelty for cruelty's sake, but rather rituals soaked in symbolism. Felines long seen as witches' familiars, spirits of mischief, and omens of the dark. But let us return, gently, to that German village with the shame flute. One young man, whose name time has nearly erased, became the subject of a tale whispered for generations after. He had been caught performing a bawdy tune in the square, something about a bishop and a barmaid, sung with scandalous glee. The town elders, unmoved by his charm, condemned him to the flute. As he was paraded about, his eyes met those of a girl behind the apothecary's stall. She did not laugh. She wept. They say the shame he carried that day followed him long after the iron was removed. But the memory of her tears softened him. He left the village not long after, and years later returned with coins, stories, and a softer voice. He never sang bawdy songs again, but he became a keeper of stories, a collector of strange punishments, and a teller of justice's odd ways. Perhaps it is his voice we follow now, drifting like a ghost across the centuries, whispering through time. And so we draw the curtain gently on our first evening together. The fire grows low, and the stars are quiet in their vigil. Yet the road is long, and many more tales await beyond the bend. In the next part of our journey, we shall venture into the courts of England, where justice bore wigs and wrath in equal measure, and where strange devices known as ducking stools and trial stones brought the weight of truth quite literally crashing down upon the accused. But that, dear dreamer, is a tale for another night. The hush of twilight clings still to the tale, and as you rest deeper into the comfort of your blanket, let us now cross the narrow sea, where mists curl low over green moors and bell towers peal solemn songs to the shifting sky. England, in the age of rooks and rustling robes, where justice sat robed in sable, its voice as cold and unyielding as the stone of its own courts. It is here, amid hedgerows and half-timbered halls, that we encounter one of the most peculiar of punishments. Gentle in appearance, but deeply unsettling in truth. The ducking stool. Constructed from stout timber and fastened to a long seesawing beam, it resembled something a child might use in play, were it not for its grim purpose. This was no seat of honor. It was a throne for the accused, nearly always a woman, lowered into the dark waters of ponds or rivers with the solemn rhythm of a pendulum. She was accused, usually, of being a scold, an overly loud wife, a troublemaker in the marketplace, a weaver of words sharper than seemed proper. There were other terms, too, whispered beneath breath, shrew, gossip, hag. Sometimes she was simply disliked. In a time when silence was a woman's virtue, her voice alone might condemn her. The village would gather in hushed reverence, or else in a half-drunken mirth. Children would cling to mothers' skirts. Old men would lean on canes carved with saints' heads. The woman would be tied to the chair, not harshly, but securely, and the stool would swing slowly out over the water. A prayer might be offered, whether for justice or for her soul was never clear. Then, with a creak of timber and the slow groan of the beam, she was lowered, submerged in the cold, silt-thick water. Sometimes she reemerged gasping, her hair clinging like riverweed. Other times she held her breath, silent even in that indignity. If she screamed, it was said she proved her guilt. If she didn't, some claimed it was the calm of a practiced liar. There was no right way to suffer, no correct posture to take when bound and judged by neighbors. Though it was not meant to kill, the ducking stool could still end a life. If the rope slipped, if the current grew fast, if fear clenched the heart too tight. And yet many survived, soaked and shivering, dragged back to the bank where shame clung to them longer than water ever could. The practice was especially beloved in towns that prized order and quiet. In one such town, Canterbury, there lived a widow named Maud Witherstone, remembered in faded parish records and half-remembered rhymes. She was a tanner's wife once, and after her husband's death, she ran the stall herself, barking prices and calling out spoiled hides when men tried to cheat her. She had a laugh like bells and a scowl like a winter cloud. When a magistrate's son came seeking leather for boots, and she refused him credit, he called her bitter, cursed, and worse. The next market day, a charge was filed, Maud accused of scolding and disturbing the peace. She was old but still strong, and her back did not bend as they led her to the ducking stool. She offered no plea. She said only, "Let the water take what it may." 3 times she was lowered. 3 times she emerged, her gray hair like a crown of kelp, her face pale but unswerving. The town, shamed by her silence, never brought another charge. But Maud spoke less afterward. She sang no more. And when she died years later, her house fell quickly to ruin, though her name lived longer than her accusers by many years. The ducking stool shared a spirit with other rituals of watery justice. Chief among them was the trial by ordeal, a practice rooted in older faiths and darker fears. One such ordeal, The trial by cold water was reserved for those accused of witchcraft or consorting with the devil. The logic was circular, as it so often was. Water, pure and holy, would reject evil. If the accused floated, they were deemed guilty. If they sank, innocence was proven, though oftentimes too late to matter. Imagine, if you will, a twilight hour beside a village pond, the surface glassy and still. A woman, arms bound tight across her chest, is lowered gently, almost reverently, into its depths. Villagers whisper prayers and superstitions in equal measure. If she bobs, pale-faced and panicked, she is doomed. If she slips under and does not rise, she is absolved but lost. The paradox of justice lies thick upon the land, yet not all punishments were reserved for women. Men, too, faced the strange dance of public discipline. In one northern shire, the whipping stone stood at the crossroads, a smooth, flat boulder where minor thieves or stubborn debtors were lashed not in private, but before all eyes. The stone grew dark over years, not from rain, but from old stains and older memories. And in London, the pillory reigned supreme, a wooden frame with holes for head and hands, placed in busy squares. Offenders stood helpless as passers-by flung filth, rotten food, or sharp words. Humiliation was its own lash. Yet here too were stories, of crowds turning on the guards, defending the accused, or of lovers secretly pressing tokens into the offender's palm, risking censure for silent solidarity. One such tale clings to the corners of Cheapside, where a baker named Ulrich was caught diluting flour with chalk. He claimed desperation, poor harvests, and a hungry family. The city elders cared not. He was sentenced to a day in the pillory, his name pinned above his head. The crowd jeered. Eggs flew. But then a boy crept forward, Ulrich's son, pressing a crust of clean bread into his father's bound hands. A quiet act, unnoticed by most, but remembered by a scribe who walked nearby. He wrote in the margin of his ledger, "He was not forgiven by law, but he was forgiven by love." As you lie now in the quiet of your chamber, warm and unburdened, consider the strangeness of such times. Justice was not always fair, nor always cruel. It was theatrical, symbolic, and deeply rooted in the fear that unseen forces might unravel the order of the world. Punishment, then, was a spell, cast not only upon the guilty, but upon the hearts of those who watched. In the next whisper of our tale, we shall step into the candlelit corridors of medieval monasteries, where silence was sacred and discipline took curious forms, where errant monks wore hoods of shame and confessions echoed not only in prayer, but in penance written across flesh and soul alike. The hours grow softer now, as though time itself has curled up at your feet, drowsy and content. The fire has burned low, but not out, and in its hush we find ourselves walking along cloistered paths, where shadows are long and footsteps echo softly. We are within the stone hearts of medieval monasteries, places of quiet devotion, unyielding discipline, and curious justice. To understand the peculiar punishments of monastic life, one must first understand its rhythm. The life of a monk was not one of wandering, nor even of personal ambition. It was a surrender, a laying down of self, in exchange for silence, obedience, and divine pursuit. Each day was measured not by the sun alone, but by the tolling of bells, matins before dawn, lauds at sunrise, and so forth through the holy cadence of the hours. Yet even within this world of prayer and parchment, the frailties of men stirred like wind beneath chapel doors. A monk might grow prideful of his calligraphy, or fall asleep during prayers. He might steal food from the cellar, or speak too freely in the cloister walks. And when these moments came, as they always did, the abbots and priors turned not to the sword, but to stranger tools of correction. Foremost among them was the culpa ceremony. When a monk sinned, no matter how slight the offense, he might be summoned before the assembled brethren during chapter, the daily meeting held in the cool morning hours. The sinner, cloaked in his dark robe, would kneel upon the stone floor, his head bowed, hands extended in silent plea. He would confess, often with a voice barely above whisper. And then the abbot would pronounce penance, not with anger, but with the measured grace of a shepherd correcting his flock. Sometimes the monk would be ordered to prostrate himself at the door of the refectory, lying face down in dust, while others stepped past him to their meals. He would eat last, if at all, and only what remained. Other times, he might wear a hood dyed gray instead of black, or be forbidden to speak even during the brief conversations allowed in the scriptorium or herb garden. More severe faults, Attempts to flee the monastery, for instance, or repeated disobedience, were met with punishments that teetered between poetic and brutal. One such was the Vigil of Correction. The monk was stripped of his robe, left to wear only coarse sackcloth, and made to kneel in the chapel all night without food or fire. No light save for the guttering candles before the altar. No company save for his own thoughts and the echoes of whispered psalms. On certain holy days, when penitents were to be welcomed back into the fold, the ceremony turned theatrical. The errant monk, barefoot and trembling, might lie stretched before the abbey door, waiting for the abbot to step over him, symbolizing both humility and rebirth. Only then could he rise and rejoin the brethren, his slate wiped clean, his soul weighed again toward grace. And yet some monasteries took these rituals to darker places. At St. Ced's Abbey in the Low Marshes, there existed a practice known only in the margins of a single tattered manuscript. There, monks who repeatedly failed their vows of silence were given the mask of Gabriel, a heavy iron visage with closed lips and empty eyes placed over the head for an entire day. It was said to be both punishment and meditation, a forced reflection on the voice, its power, and the stillness it disturbed. Then there were the silent cells, narrow, stone-walled chambers barely wider than a coffin. A monk who dared challenge the authority of the rule might be placed inside for days, surviving on bread, water, and scripture. The only light came through a tiny slit in the wall, enough to read by, barely enough to dream. The sound of the world was reduced to wind and bird song, which passed through like spirits. Despite the grimness, not all punishments were so austere. Many monasteries favored symbolic acts, digging graves that would never be filled, walking barefoot over cold flagstones, or copying ancient texts by candlelight until the hands trembled and the ink blurred. It was not pain they sought, but purification. Consider the case of Brother Elias of Fountains Abbey, whose sin was not theft or violence, but vanity. He was a gifted illuminator, and his illustrations of saints' lives were known even in distant monasteries. But pride crept in like ivy upon old stone. He began signing his name beneath each image, though the rule forbade it. When discovered, his punishment was not destruction of his work, but a peculiar penance. For 1 year, he was forbidden to use ink. He copied texts in silence using only water, his pages blank to all eyes but his own. When at last his penance was lifted, it was said his next illuminated psalter brought even the most stern-hearted prior to tears. In the margins of that volume, he wrote not his name, but simply, "All glory to the hand beyond my own." These were the punishments of a world withdrawn from the clamor of villages and kings, a world where the soul was the battlefield, and correction was both ritual and mercy. They believed that each fault, no matter how small, echoed into eternity. And so, every penance was a chance to recalibrate the soul's compass. Tonight, as you rest in the stillness of your chamber, perhaps you can imagine the hush of those cloisters, the shuffle of sandals on stone, the scent of candle wax and old vellum, the distant chant of monks reciting the hours. A world of whispers and discipline, of hidden sorrow and solemn hope. In the next chapter of our journey, we shall step beyond monastery walls and into the colorful bustle of medieval festivals, where punishment took yet another curious form: public foolery, staged penance, and elaborate charades meant to teach the law through laughter. A world where justice wore motley and morality danced to the tune of jesters and drums. The night deepens, and with it comes a warmth not from fire, but from the gentle curiosity that lives in your heart as you listen. The tale now moves with a lighter step, still cloaked in history, but touched by color, song, and laughter. Let us wander now from cloisters to cobbled streets, from the hush of the holy to the raucous heart of village festivals, where punishment came clad not in iron, but in jest. In the tapestry of medieval life, the line between sacred and profane, law and laughter was never fixed. There were days when justice took to the streets not with a sword, but with a painted face and a wooden baton. These were the feasts of fools, the festivals of misrule, and the public penances masked in merriment. For a world as deeply bound by hierarchy and duty as the Middle Ages, there was something both therapeutic and calculated about turning those rules upside down, if only for a day. During such festivals, especially around Christmastide or the Feast of Corpus Christi, towns would stage elaborate parades, plays, and pantomimes. The whole community might gather in the square, where stages were erected, minstrels tuned their lutes, and vendors called out the delights of candied figs and sweetmeats. But amid the spectacle was a hidden order. The punishment of the foolish, the sinful, and the disobedient, all performed as if it were sport. Take, for instance, the Festival of the Ass, celebrated in parts of France. A man, often a villager known for some minor wrongdoing, mockery of the priest, idleness at work, or known drunkenness, was chosen to play the Ass King. He would be dressed in tattered robes, a bridle about his head, and led through the town on a donkey backward, while the townspeople sang hymns of nonsense and praise. It was not done in cruelty, not entirely. There was laughter and wine and some degree of affection, but it served its purpose. The Ass King was reminded of his foolishness, and the community, in joining the ritual, reaffirmed its moral boundaries. The festival ended with a symbolic gesture. The bridle removed, the man offered bread and ale, a return to dignity through theatrical descent. In England, the tradition of the boy bishop bore similar contradictions. On certain feast days, a young choir boy would be elected to act as bishop, complete with vestments and a mock crozier. But alongside the innocent play came a subtler form of rebuke. Sometimes a priest who had grown too proud or too lazy would be made to serve the boy, performing menial tasks before the chuckling congregation. Laughter here became a tool of correction, not harsh, but pointed. More theatrical still were the morality plays, traveling performances funded by guilds and watched by townsfolk in every corner of the realm. These plays carried lessons beneath their humor, depicting gluttony as a fat man always eating, pride as a peacock-cloaked noblewoman, and sloth as a snoring, drooling fool. Those who had earned the ire of the guild might be made to play their own sins, acting out their transgressions in costume for all to see. It was a punishment wrapped in theater, a spectacle that blurred the line between atonement and entertainment. A particularly curious example comes from a Flemish town near Bruges, where a notorious local tailor named Willem the Shortthread was known for cutting corners, both literally and figuratively, in his garments. After many complaints, the Guild of Tailors arranged for his penance to be performed during the midsummer fair. He was dressed in a suit stitched from scraps, with seams exaggerated and sleeves mismatched, and made to walk behind a troupe of dancers holding a banner that read, "Measure twice, cut once." The crowd roared with laughter, and though his pride took a blow, Willem's reputation mended in time, as did his work. But not all such punishments were jovial in spirit. There existed, too, a darker shade of the comedic, a mockery that cut deep. In some towns, women accused of adultery or lewdness were forced to wear masks with grotesque features, exaggerated noses, warped mouths, and walk behind puppet representations of themselves. Men found guilty of cowardice in militia service might be dressed as women, complete with spinning distaffs, and paraded through the streets to the tolling of bells. The intention, always, was correction through public shame, but also through memory. These performances stayed in the minds of the villagers long after the fair tents had been packed away. The moral lived on, not written in parchment, but etched in spectacle. And yet, amid the jesters' cries and the painted stagecraft, there flickered a tenderness too. For medieval communities were not cruel by nature. They were close-knit, bound by weather, work, and the ticking of the church bell. Public foolery, in many ways, allowed tensions to release like steam from a kettle. It let a village confront its sins and silliness without bloodshed or bitterness. A shared laughter could bind people tighter than shared fear. In one Yorkshire village, a ritual persisted for centuries. Each Shrove Tuesday, a man known for some local misdeed was made to wear a giant pair of wooden shoes and walk from the churchyard to the river and back again, each step echoing with a clownish clack. But each year, the crowd followed him not with scorn, but with songs and pies and paper garlands. It was not mockery. It was ritual rebirth. And so, as you lie now, breathing soft and even, know that even in punishment there existed play. Justice wore many masks in the Middle Ages. Sometimes it wept, sometimes it howled, and sometimes it danced. Next, our journey shall take a darker turn once more, toward the courts of medieval Italy, where punishments were crafted with terrifying precision, crimes answered not with brute force but with symbolic torture, legal poetry, and the iron elegance of the city-states. the night thickens like ink upon a manuscript, and as dreams begin to rustle softly beneath your thoughts, we find ourselves now in a different world, one of arches and alleys, of lantern-lit piazzas and cool marble beneath the foot. Welcome to medieval Italy, a land not only of passion and art, but of justice so refined it often resembled theater, cruel and calculated in equal measure. In the bustling city-states of Florence, Siena, and Bologna, the laws were penned with elegant severity. Here, punishment was less about immediate spectacle and more about lasting impression, etched not just upon the flesh, but upon the memory of all who bore witness. In these city-states, where rivalry thrived and reputation was everything, justice became a canvas on which fear was painted with exquisite brushstrokes. Let us begin with the concept of pena infamante, the punishment of infamy. This was a civic branding of the soul, a declaration that one's honor had been torn apart before all eyes. For merchants who forged documents, for scribes who twisted truth, and for debtors who fled responsibility, this punishment meant more than prison or whip. It meant social death. A notary, for example, caught altering a contract, might be sentenced to walk barefoot through the city square with a paper hat shaped like a dunce's cap, inscribed with the words, "Traitor to Trust." Others were forced to ride backward on a donkey, a symbol of their inverted moral compass, while criers shouted their sins aloud for all to hear. The intention was to destroy reputation so thoroughly that no shop, no table, no church pew would ever again offer them space. In Florence, an apothecary convicted of watering down his tinctures was paraded through the Mercato Vecchio with empty bottles dangling from ropes around his neck, a cruel parody of the life he had once lived. Behind him walked children hired to chant, "Here walks one who sells water for wine and lies for bread." The punishment cost him not just coin, but the trust of his neighbors, without which no Florentine could survive. But even more chilling were the punishments devised by the podesta, the high magistrates sent from outside to ensure fairness and prevent corruption. These men were strangers to the towns they ruled, sworn to impartiality, and thus free to wield the law with a cold detachment that often bordered on artistry. One such punishment was known as la pena del tamburo, the drum penalty. Reserved for soldiers who deserted their posts, it involved being marched through the city while a single drum beat slowly behind. No chains, no blood, just the sound, relentless and slow, as the condemned man walked the main streets under the weight of 1,000 watching eyes. At each piazza, he stopped. A herald read his name and his crime. Then the drum resumed. It was said the beat echoed in the minds of the living far longer than the toll of any bell. In the Venetian Republic, where secrecy and statecraft twined like ivy around every marble column, punishment took on even more elaborate forms. Venice punished not with loud cries, but with silent removals. Those who betrayed secrets of the state might wake to find a black mark upon their door. No trial, no procession. The accused would vanish that very night, taken through quiet corridors and into the waiting cells of the Doge's prison. Their fate, often, was never spoken of again. And then, of course, there was the Bridge of Sighs. Its name, in later centuries, would inspire poetry and sorrow, but in its earliest days, it was a simple stone passage that connected the interrogation rooms of the Doge's palace to the prison across the canal. Those sentenced to punishment would walk this bridge only once. The sighs were not poetic. They were real, ragged, and final. Let us pause for a moment and meet a man named Matteo di Rovigno, a silk merchant of some local repute in the port city of Genoa. Matteo, it is said, was a charming man with a knack for borrowing, money, favors, names, and returning little of what he took. When his creditors finally forced trial, the court found his ledgers full of forged accounts. But instead of prison, Matteo was sentenced to a punishment they called la camicia rosa, the red shirt. For 7 days, he was made to wear a crimson tunic embroidered with golden thread that read, "Let every deal be sealed in truth." He walked the squares of Genoa at set hours, head uncovered, carrying a large ledger that had been scorched and bound shut with iron bands. It was not pain that punished him. It was display. When the week was over, Matteo was free. But not a single merchant would trade with him again. Perhaps the most grotesque, yet poetic of all punishments in this time was the use of symbolic mutilation. A man who bore false witness might have his lips branded with a tiny hot iron in the shape of a cross, signifying the broken oath. Thieves of religious items were sometimes sentenced to kiss the feet of every pilgrim entering the church for a full fortnight, clothed in sack and ash. It was public, it was exhausting, and it reeked of penance. And yet, within this cruel pageantry, there remained a glimmer of grace. For many city-states allowed those who had been punished to seek reintegration, not through silence or exile, but through public confession and works of charity. A man might pay to repair a church roof. A woman might sponsor a public fountain. In doing so, they rewrote their story, not erasing the past, but tempering it with humility. So now, as the wind outside quiets and your breath deepens, know that justice in medieval Italy was not always swift or kind, but it was deliberate, layered like a fresco, with meanings that outlived the moment. To be punished here was to become a part of the civic memory, a living parable etched into the marble bones of the city. In the next chapter, we shall cross borders once more, journeying north to the frost-bitten lands of Scandinavia, where punishment came with sagas, where shame was shouted across fjords, and where the echo of one man's crime could linger in the mountains longer than his name. The stars now glisten faintly beyond frost-kissed glass, and the air has grown still, as though the world itself holds its breath in quiet remembrance. Let us now travel to a land shaped by cold winds and long winters, to Scandinavia, where pine forests shroud ancient secrets, and justice moves not only through courts and laws, but through story, song, and stone. In these northern realms, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, the medieval notion of punishment was braided tightly with honor. Here, shame did not only belong to the body. It lived in the voice of the village, the whispers of kin, and the weight of sagas that echoed across fjords and fields. To be punished was to be named, and to be named was to be remembered. And often, the memory was the cruelest part of all. In the early medieval period, justice was often clan-bound. Crimes were not always judged by a central authority, but by things. Public assemblies held beneath open sky, where men gathered to debate, accuse, and sentence. These gatherings, held on hills or beneath sacred trees, had an air of solemnity mingled with ceremony. The accused stood among neighbors, surrounded not by iron bars, but by eyes. There was one punishment known simply as nithinger, a term that carried a sting far beyond its letters. To be declared a nithinger was to be cast out, not from land or law, but from society itself. It meant you had broken the invisible contract of honor, cowardice in battle, betrayal of kin, or treachery against one's lord. The punishment was not always death, but something colder, outlawry. A man declared nithinger was no longer protected. His name was blackened. His possessions were forfeit. He could be hunted by any who pleased, and no blood price would be accepted for his murder. One tale, still murmured in the sagas, tells of Ulfr Ketilsson, a landholder near Trondheim. It was said he had stolen from the temple of Thor, taking coins from the offering chest in a bitter winter to feed his livestock. When the theft was discovered, he did not deny it, but he offered no remorse either. The thing met, voices clashed like antlers, and at last the judgment came. Ulfr was branded Nithinger. They say he fled into the forests, building a crude shelter beside a frozen brook. He lived by trapping hares and fish, speaking to no one. But each spring, someone would carve a single word into a pine near his hut. Scum, shame. After 3 years, Ulfr vanished. Whether by cold, wolf, or blade, no one could say. But the tree still stands, and on stormy nights, some claim you can hear the whisper of his name in the wind. Not all punishments were banishments. Some were theatrical, brutal in symbolism. In parts of Denmark, a man caught breaking a truce between clans might be sentenced to carry a scamstock, a shame staff. This was a long pole, carved with the runes of his sin, which he was forced to hold upright in the village square from dawn until dusk. No one could speak to him. He could not sit. The staff was both confession and burden. Wives who committed adultery were sometimes made to wear iron collars, heavy and cold, etched with serpents or thorns. These collars were locked in place for days, and the woman made to walk the village boundaries in silence. It was not the iron that hurt most. It was the eyes of her neighbors, the unspoken sentence of isolation. Yet in many tales, these women endured their punishment with quiet strength, and some later became healers or wise women, finding new place on the edge of society. In Iceland, the sagas speak of blood feuds, crimes answered not with court but with kin. Yet even here, rules existed. A man who killed another unlawfully might be given a chance to pay wergild, a blood price. But if he failed, he faced Fjorbausgarður, 3 years of exile. During this time, he could not return to any human settlement. He became a shadow, a figure glimpsed across the tundra, living on the mercy of the gods and the animals of the wild. One such man, Hallgrim the Black, was said to have lived in a sea cave near the West Fjords. His crime, striking down a man during a wedding quarrel. Though the law had granted him 3 years of exile, the family of the slain vowed vengeance should he ever return. So Hallgrim stayed away longer than his sentence required. 10 winters passed. When he finally returned, old and thin, the new generation no longer knew his face. But they knew the tale, and that was enough. Yet not all punishments were so grim. Some, especially among the Sami and coastal Norse communities, carried an element of riddling ritual. Thieves might be made to wear wooden fish on their heads, painted in bright colors, too large to ignore, and sing rhymes admitting their guilt. These acts were designed not to humiliate alone, but to reweave the broken thread between the individual and the community. For in a land where winter could kill, exile was not only punishment, it was peril. Scandinavia's justice was not housed in marble halls. It was carried in the voices of elders, the murmurs of firelit gatherings, the songs passed from mouth to mouth. Punishment was not separate from story. It was part of it. A man's crime lived on in the verses sung about him. Redemption, if it came, did not come through forgetting, but through enduring. And so now, as you lie beneath your own quiet roof, know that the North once held its wrongdoers to account, not only with sword or chain, but with memory. To be named in a saga, whether as hero or coward, was the truest sentence of all. In the chapter that follows, we shall descend into the realm of the Holy Roman Empire, where the machinery of justice grew intricate, where cities erected permanent structures for punishment, and where the very stones bore witness to 1,000 confessions carved in the language of iron and law. The hush of midnight is full upon the land now, and even the trees outside seem to sway slower, gentler, as if listening. And so we continue, stepping with soft reverence into the vast and shadowed realm of the Holy Roman Empire. An empire sprawling in both time and place, where justice bore the weight of centuries and the chill of precision. Here, in the myriad principalities and duchies scattered across the heart of Europe, punishment evolved into a structure as methodical as the empire itself. Cities grew tall and crowded, stone replacing timber, order striving to contain chaos. And with this growth came the formalization of justice, codified, witnessed, and in many places enshrined in the very architecture of civic life. No symbol of this era looms larger than the Gerichtsturm, the Judgment Tower. In cities like Nuremberg, Regensburg, and Frankfurt, these towers stood not merely as prisons, but as embodiments of law. They rose beside town halls, built of gray stone, windowless except for slits that let in cold light. Inside, winding staircases led to cells, interrogation chambers, and in some cases, the execution floor. The towers were not only feared, they were known. Children grew up with their silhouettes etched into memory. It is within these towers that one finds the first appearance of torture by design, a systematized process not driven by wrath or vengeance, but by legal precedent. The law allowed, under tightly controlled circumstances, the use of physical persuasion to extract confessions. It was called pijnlijke bevraging, or painful questioning. And while it bore rules, those rules did not soften its edge. In Augsburg, a record survives of a co-opper named Jörg Hollens, accused of stealing sacred relics from a chapel. He denied the charge. For 2 days, he was questioned without force. On the third, with permission from the council, he was shown the instruments, thumb screws, leg vices, the strappado, a method where the victim's hands were bound behind their back and then lifted by a rope tied to the wrists before being dropped suddenly, dislocating shoulders without spilling a drop of blood. The records state that Jörg confessed, though whether the truth emerged or only the pain, none can say. He was hanged 3 days later at dawn. His confession was carved into a wooden plaque and nailed beside the chapel door, a reminder not of his crime alone, but of the reach of the law. Yet not all punishment within the empire was so bodily. Many punishments were designed for the mind, the pride, the social standing. The shan mask, or shame mask, was one such invention, an iron face covering, often grotesquely stylized with exaggerated features. Long noses for liars, large tongues for gossips, donkey ears for fools. These masks were locked in place and worn in public, often with bells that rang with each step, drawing attention and ridicule. Imagine the weight, not just the iron upon your face, but the laughter that follows your every move, the memory of neighbors' eyes upon you as you trudge past the blacksmith's forge or the weaver's stall. These punishments were not momentary. They lingered long after the mask was gone, staining the soul with public memory. There were also the pillory and the stocks, common across Europe but particularly refined in the empire. The pranger, as the Germans called it, was often set in the center of the market. Offenders were locked by neck and wrists, their crimes posted above their heads. Some were pelted with rotten vegetables. Others were forced to wear mocking garments. A baker caught selling underweight loaves might wear a chain of wooden bread rolls, each carved smaller than the last. In Strasbourg, a unique punishment existed for dishonest wine sellers. A large wooden cask was hollowed out and fashioned into a suit with holes for arms and legs. The offender was placed inside, barrel-bound, and made to roll or waddle through the streets. It was called the Weinfasslauf, the wine barrel walk. Children laughed, merchants sneered, but beneath the comedy was a sharp reminder. Commerce, like faith, was sacred. Some cities also employed symbolic punishment steeped in civic ritual. In Ulm, thieves were made to sweep the cathedral steps barefoot, wearing linen tunics stitched with their crimes in red thread. In Cologne, a baker who cheated his customers might be made to kneel before the city's bread guild, present a perfect loaf, and publicly recite the recipe aloud, a declaration that he had learned his lesson, grain by grain. And still, the empire did not reserve its strange punishments solely for the living. There exists a chilling practice, recorded in multiple cities, known as execution in effigy. If a nobleman or criminal fled before judgment could be served, a life-size puppet was created in their likeness. This effigy was paraded through the city and executed in place of the man himself, burned, hanged, or beheaded depending on the sentence. The crowd watched, not in disbelief, but in solemn acceptance. The punishment, they believed, must be seen, even if the guilty could not. In all these rituals, a common thread emerges. Punishment was both spectacle and statement. The Holy Roman Empire, with its patchwork of laws and liberties, believed deeply in the visibility of justice. It was not enough that crime be punished. It had to be witnessed, recorded, and remembered. So now, as the night holds you closer, let these visions fade like old stone beneath soft moss. The towers still stand in some cities, their windows blind and silent. The masks rest in museums, stripped of terror but still whispering of what once was. And the names, those names once shouted from pulpits or nailed to doors, are now little more than sighs in the pages of ancient ledgers. In the next part of our journey, we will travel to the windswept Isles of Ireland and the Highlands of Scotland, where justice was carved from earth and clan, and where some punishments were carried not in iron chains, but in the haunting melodies of old Celtic songs. Now the darkness outside is thick as peat smoke, and the hush within seems to deepen with each breath, as if the world itself were curling into sleep. And into this quiet, we step lightly into the mists of the Celtic lands, Ireland and Scotland, where the stones are old, the hills carry stories in their silence, and justice was born not only from laws, but from memory, music, and the blood of kin. In these wild and wind-lashed corners of medieval Europe, the concept of punishment did not always rest in dungeons or gallows. It lived in the honor of families, in the oaths sworn before chieftains, and in the binding threads of the Brehon and Gaelic legal traditions. Here, the law was less a blade and more a braid, woven through generations, shaped by terrain, and deeply rooted in the belief that every wrong was a wound to the whole clan. Among the Irish, the Brehon laws governed not with a king's decree, but with the wisdom of appointed judges, wandering arbiters who carried knowledge and memory rather than script. These laws, ancient even by medieval reckoning, prioritized restitution over violence. The idea was not to remove the wrongdoer, but to rebalance the world. If a man stole cattle, a grave offense in a society where wealth was measured in livestock, He was ordered to repay not just the stolen beasts, but often more in value, depending on the status of the victim. Failure to repay could lead to distress, where the injured party might legally seize the offender's goods, his land, or even his hospitality. For in Celtic law, shame was a potent force. A man whose house was shunned, whose fire went untended by neighbors, was as good as banished. Yet there were stranger, more poetic punishments too. The satirical poem, or air, was one such tool. To compose a public air about a wrongdoer was to curse them in verse, to expose their sins through the sharp edge of poetry. These verses were performed aloud at markets, gatherings, or even in front of the offender's dwelling. The belief was strong that such satire could bring misfortune, even disease, upon the one targeted. It was not the whip, but the word, that cut deepest. One tale from County Clare tells of a smith named Donnell who had shortchanged a widow on her husband's funeral tools. She brought the matter to a traveling brehon who ruled not for silver, but for song. A bard was summoned to the forge, and there he stood, declaiming a verse that mocked Donnell's skill, his honor, even the crookedness of his anvil. By the week's end, no one in the village would bring iron to his door. Donnell, they say, left by moonlight and never returned. In Scotland, the Highland clans had their own customs of censure, fierce and familial. Crimes within the clan were punished internally, often with exile, a sentence as terrifying as death in a land so bound to kinship. A man cast out could not enter another clan without suspicion. He wandered the glens alone, living in caves, speaking to no one. These broken men, as they were called, often became bandits or ghosts in the stories of children. More theatrical was the cucking stool, used rarely, but remembered long. Unlike its English counterpart, which involved ducking in water, the Scottish version was a high-backed wooden chair, placed upon a platform for all to see. Women accused of scolding, gossip, or disobedience might be bound to it and paraded through the village. But the true sting came not from ropes or ridicule, it came from song. Villagers would follow, singing improvised verses, mocking the woman's habits, her tongue, her pride. Some sang with cruelty, others with a kind of bitter affection, but all sang, and the tune would linger far longer than the punishment itself. Among the Gaels, shame was not shouted, it was sung. Yet there were deeper, older echoes in the land's justice, echoes that came from the Druids, from the stones, from rituals remembered more in rhythm than in rule. In some places, those who committed grave offenses, murder, betrayal, sorcery, were not punished by man, but by the land itself. A circle of elders might lead the condemned to a sacred site, often a stone ring or a glen believed to be thin between worlds. There, under moonlight, the sentence was given, to live alone in silence, to speak no name, to dwell where the sun touched last. One such place was said to lie near the Isle of Skye, where a cave known as Tig Nam Fuam Hyrian, the House of the Giants, was used to hold those who had defied the balance of clan and cosmos. No iron bars kept them in. Only the shame, the silence, and the belief that to break the sentence would bring curses upon their descendants. And still, there were punishments performed not on men, but on memory. A family whose member committed an unforgivable crime might lose its standing within the bardic traditions. Their lineage would be omitted from songs, their deeds unrecorded. In a world where history lived in breath and string and harp, such erasure was a death of legacy. It was not the man who was punished, it was his memory, his story, made to vanish like mist upon the moor. So now, as your breath slows and your eyes grow heavy, think of those who bore their punishments not beneath stone walls, but beneath the weight of song and shadow. Their crimes became tales, their tales became warnings, and their names, if still spoken, are done so only in half-light and hushed voice. In our next tale, we shall journey far eastward, beyond the Rhine and the Carpathians, to the edge of Christendom, where medieval Eastern Europe forged punishments both brutal and Byzantine, where guilt wore iron, and silence was bought with blood and fire. The night grows deeper still, like a velvet curtain pulled close around the soul. And in this silence, we cross to the shadowed frontiers of medieval Eastern Europe, a land both wild and ordered, where dark forests whispered in tongues older than Latin, and cities rose in stone and smoke beneath the rule of princes, voivodes, and czars. Here, in the broad and haunted lands that would one day become Poland, Hungary, Romania, and the far reaches of Rus, punishment bore a more elemental shape. It was born not only from law, but from fear of the devil, of the Turk, of winter itself. And so justice often took on a form that was theatrical, superstitious, and unflinching. The law codes of this region were strange tapestries woven from Roman remnants, Byzantine influence, Slavic oral traditions, and Christian dogma. One of the most famous was the Russkaya Pravda, the legal code of Kievan Rus, first written down in the 11th century. It was detailed, practical, and deeply rooted in compensation. A stolen horse, a slain servant, a burned barn, each bore its price in silver or livestock. But when the crime reached beyond the measurable, sacrilege, treason, or sorcery, then punishment became something else entirely. Take the case of tongue burning, a punishment reserved for false witnesses or those who cursed sacred icons. The condemned would be tied to a pillar in the market square, and a heated iron spoon pressed gently against the tongue. It was not designed to kill, but to silence. The victim could still speak, but only through pain. In a land where the word was considered sacred, to corrupt it was to invite fire. In the forests of Wallachia, beneath the watch of jagged Carpathian peaks, the punishments were often visceral, driven by princely edict and fear of rebellion. Here ruled voivodes, military lords who wielded justice with both sword and superstition. One of the most notorious, of course, was Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler. While his legend is thick with myth and shadow, many of the punishments recorded under his rule have the sharp ring of terrifying reality. Impalement was not just execution. It was spectacle. A sharpened stake was driven into the body, often through the lower torso, and raised upright so the victim's own weight completed the process. It could take hours, even days, for death to come. Vlad used this not merely to kill, but to send a message. Entire forests were said to be planted with impaled corpses along the roads near Targoviste. The stench was unbearable, but the silence of his enemies was assured. Yet brutality was not reserved only for warlords. In the cities of Krakow and Wal, the civic authorities devised punishments that were both symbolic and physical. Thieves had their ears cut, not off entirely, but notched, so all could see their past with a glance. Bakers who shorted customers might be nailed by the ear to their own shop doors, the nail removed only when they paid restitution or when a set number of hours had passed. There is a record of one such baker, Marek of Toruń, who was found guilty of adding groundstone to his flour. He was forced to eat a full loaf of his own bread, baked from the same spoiled batch, before being paraded through the square with a millstone tied to his neck. The stone did not strangle him, but it burdened him. The message was clear. The weight of dishonesty must be carried. Sorcery, too, was treated with a harsh and theatrical hand. In Moldavia, women accused of cursing crops or causing illness were sometimes subjected to the cold test. This was a form of ordeal wherein the accused was submerged in an icy stream tied to a wooden beam. If they floated, it was seen as a sign of guilt. The water, pure and blessed, would reject evil. If they sank, they were innocent, though often in grave peril. Sound familiar? Perhaps it echoes the ducking stools of elsewhere. But here it was often done in silence, with only the rushing of the stream and the murmurs of frightened kin. In Hungary, the pillory of sound was recorded in a few towns. The guilty party, often a gossip or slanderer, was shackled to a post bearing a large iron bell. The punishment? To ring the bell once each hour for a full day, crying aloud their sin with each chime. The town grew used to the sound, and the shame echoed long after the final toll. One peculiar punishment, found in the rural courts of Bohemia, involved the use of masks made of wood and leather. Not unlike the shame masks of the Holy Roman Empire, these were carved into grotesque forms, devils with gaping mouths, pigs, or leering faces with horns. The guilty were made to wear them in church, forced to kneel at the back during Mass. Children would stare, elders would sigh. The masks were not chained, but their weight was moral, unrelenting. A story passed down from the forests near Brno tells of a woman named Lida who was accused of spreading discord by predicting deaths. She was not a witch, exactly, merely a midwife with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. She was made to wear a death mask carved with black paint and bone-white teeth, and to carry a broken hourglass as she walked through the village. It was her sentence to remind others of their own endings. But the tale does not end there. Some say she later became a healer again, welcomed quietly by those who had once cast her out. Perhaps the land remembered, even if the law had not. These punishments, strange and cruel, were reflections of a world where order was fragile and fear was a tool. The East, for all its beauty and depth, bore the weight of invading armies, plagues, heresies, and cold. Justice became not just correction, but a ritual of survival, a reminder to all that the world was always one breath from chaos. And now, as you drift ever closer to sleep, let the iron masks and frost-bound rivers fade into shadow. Let the whispers of those long past settle like snow upon your thoughts. For in the next chapter, we shall sail south to the sunlit ports of the Mediterranean, where punishment came in silk and fire, where pirates and princes danced along the edge of law, and justice smelled of salt, spice, and smoke. The waves sigh softly beyond the curtain of dreams now, and in their rhythm we follow, southward, to where the air grows warm and briny, and the scent of citrus mingles with wood smoke and sea. This is the Mediterranean, sun-drenched and sharp, where justice shimmered like heat rising off a tiled rooftop, beautiful in form, but never without fire. In the coastal cities of Genoa, Venice, Barcelona, and Palermo, the dance between crime and punishment played out with all the drama and elegance of a staged opera. These were ports of trade, of secrets, of sailors and saints. And in such places, where wealth changed hands beneath frescoed ceilings and shadows crept in on every tide, justice could be theatrical, symbolic, and cruelly inventive. One of the most curious forms of punishment in the Mediterranean was marking, the indelible branding of guilt upon the body. A thief might have the letter T scorched into his shoulder, a swindler the word ladro, thief, burned into his palm. These marks were meant to be seen, to be read. They became part of a person's skin, visible even in silence. There was no erasing, only covering, and even the covering brought suspicion. In Venice, where the law was wrapped in layers of ritual and republican dignity, punishments were often carried out not in dark alleys, but in open piazzas. A dishonest merchant, for instance, might be forced to sit atop the Colonna Infame, a low stone pedestal in the Piazza San Marco, bareheaded beneath the noon sun, with a sign hung from his neck detailing his misdeed. It was not the heat that punished him, but the gaze of every passerby, every former customer, every child who pointed and asked aloud, "What did he do?" For more serious crimes, such as fraud against the state or slander against noble families, there existed a punishment known as the carro della vergogna, the cart of shame. The offender would be placed in a small wooden cart, dressed in motley or bright red robes, and drawn slowly through the winding alleys by donkeys. Children and apprentices followed, singing songs of mockery written especially for the occasion. Once the ride was over, the cart was left beneath the offender's window for 3 days, a lingering reminder that his fall from grace had taken a scenic route. Along the Spanish coast, in cities like Valencia and Malaga, the auto da fe served as the most solemn and theatrical of all punishments. Though often associated with the Inquisition, these public ceremonies included secular wrongdoers as well. Offenders were dressed in sanbenitos, yellow tunics painted with their sins, and made to march through the city accompanied by friars chanting prayers. The punishments varied: lashes, penance, exile, or worse. But always it was public. Always it was performance. Even piracy, which flourished along the Mediterranean coastlines, was punished with a particular flair. Captured corsairs were often executed not at sea, but in harbors, chained to the prows of their own ships, turned from raiders into warnings. In Malta, a pirate named Yusuf ibn Rahman was made to stand, shackled and sunburnt, beside a massive iron anchor that had once belonged to his vessel. There he remained for 3 days before the gallows took him. It is said the harbor master placed a lemon in his mouth before hanging, a final gesture of bitterness. But not all Mediterranean punishments were rooted in violence or spectacle. Some bore the grace of poetry, even when cruel. In Naples, a man accused of seducing multiple women under false promises of marriage was sentenced to carry a bouquet of roses through the entire city, barefoot and in silence, pausing at every fountain to offer one flower to the Madonna. By the end, he held only thorns. In Sicily, where folklore and faith walked hand in hand, a tailor who had sewn funeral garments for the living, selling false mourning clothes to claim pity and charity, was sentenced not to death, but to watch. He was made to sit every day in the cemetery facing the chapel from sunrise to sunset. He could not speak nor look away, only stare at the gates where the real mourners passed and learn the difference between costume and grief. In the more remote island towns, especially in Corsica and Sardinia, blood feuds still simmered behind stone walls and whispered oaths. Here, justice often bypassed courts altogether. But when it was formal, it could be eerie in its symbolism. A murderer might be forced to wear the shoes of the man he had slain, to walk for one entire week from town to town, sleeping in the same places his victim once had. He would be fed the same meals, drink from the same stream, a ghost walk of penance, binding the living to the dead until the debt was felt not in gold, but in soul. In the end, the Mediterranean world punished not merely to correct, but to instruct. Its justice sang, sometimes cruelly, sometimes wisely. It taught through shame, through beauty, through repetition. A man punished once in public might relive the moment 1,000 times in memory, each time more vivid than the last. For in these lands where the sun shows all things, there was nowhere to hide from what you had done. And so, as the waves outside your thoughts roll gently on, let the colors of the Mediterranean dim to twilight. The plazas are empty now, the bells have ceased, and the men once punished stand only in memory, their stories soft as silk worn thin by time. In the next chapter, we shall venture into the lands ruled by the Ottoman Empire, where justice was wielded with a balance of brutal swiftness and deeply layered ritual, where crime and punishment moved beneath domes and crescents, through courts echoing with quiet fear and ancient law. Now, as the tide of dreams draws you deeper, we enter the lands of minarets and mosaics, of incense smoke and solemn chants, the dominion of the Ottoman Empire. A realm vast and many-voiced, where justice wore robes of both silk and steel, and where punishment moved with the quiet gravity of tradition, as old as the caliphs and the sands of time. Stretching from the Balkans to the gates of Persia, the Ottoman Empire governed a tapestry of peoples and faiths, languages and customs. And yet, beneath this diversity ran the steady pulse of Kanun, imperial law, shaped by both Islamic jurisprudence and the edicts of the sultans. Justice here was swift, meticulous, and often invisible until the moment it struck. In Istanbul, once Constantinople, justice was administered from the Divan, the imperial council chamber within Topkapi Palace. Here, the Grand Vizier presided beneath a golden dome, scribes at his side, as petitions were heard, judgments weighed, and fates sealed with the stroke of a reed pen. Yet many punishments, especially for the lower classes, were carried out not in courts, but in streets, markets, and courtyards. Quiet performances seen by many, spoken of by few. For minor crimes, petty theft, disorderly conduct, breaking fast during Ramadan, punishment was often corporal but carefully measured. A common sentence was the falaka, the beating of the soles of the feet with rods. The offender was held face down, ankles bound and lifted, as strokes were delivered. The pain was sharp, humiliating, and left no lasting scar, only memory. The falaka was both warning and deterrent, its sting quick, its lesson deep. In the bazaar cities, Aleppo, Cairo, Bursa, certain trades enforced their own peculiar punishments through the guilds. A dishonest butcher might be forced to wear a necklace of spoiled meat and parade through the market he had defiled. A baker found to use underweight loaves would have a millstone placed upon his back and be led in silence past every shop. These punishments were not imposed from above, but born from within the community itself. They preserved trust where law alone could not. One particularly striking punishment, documented in Ottoman records from the mid-1500s, was reserved for false witnesses in court. A man who bore false testimony, especially in matters of land, inheritance, or marital disputes, might have his face blackened with soot and be led on a donkey through the streets of his own quarter, backwards, clutching a broom made of reeds. The townspeople would follow, singing mock verses, calling him Yalancha, liar. The broom symbolized both the sweeping away of his words and his duty to clean the shame he brought upon the community. In cases of treason, espionage, or sedition, however, the Ottomans acted with a terrifying efficiency. There was no public trial, no fanfare. The condemned, often a court official, advisor, or janissary, would receive a silent visit in the night from the Bostanche, the imperial guards. Strangled with a silken bowstring to preserve the sanctity of noble blood, The bodies were quietly removed, their names erased from records, their deeds spoken of only in whispers. This method, so swift and bloodless, became known as the cord of silence. Yet even this execution bore layers of ritual. It was considered an act of mercy that the condemned not be beheaded. The silk cord represented a death without dishonor, a final dignity granted in death that might temper the harshness of judgment. There were no crowds, no gallows, only the hush of draped corridors and footsteps that did not echo. In the far provinces, particularly in the Balkans, punishment took on different forms, mingled with local traditions. In Bosnia, those who broke fast during Ramadan publicly without cause might be sentenced to sit outside the mosque with a pot of ashes on their head for the length of the Friday sermon. It was symbolic shame, a mark of impurity made visible. Meanwhile, in Anatolia, villages governed by elders still practiced a system of restitution that mirrored older tribal laws. A thief might be sentenced not only to return stolen goods, but to serve in the household he wronged, chopping wood, fetching water, kneading dough, until the family declared themselves made whole. It was humiliation, yes, but also redemption, lived out day by day. There is a tale from Bursa of a young man who slandered a respected imam, falsely accusing him of theft. When the truth came to light, the council ruled that the boy must attend every sermon the imam gave for a full year, and after each, stand before the congregation and recite a verse of the Quran in praise of truth. Over time, his tone changed. What began as rote penance became reverence, and when the year was done, the imam forgave him fully, placing a hand on the boy's head in blessing. Such was the heart of Ottoman punishment. Justice, yes, but not always vengeance. There was room in some corners for repentance and return, but there were also darker corners. In the salt mines of Crimea, prisoners were sent in silence, chains rusting with brine, to dig until their names were forgotten. In the fortress of Yedikul, the 7 towers of Istanbul, traders were confined to cells so narrow they could not lie down. Their food passed through slits. Their stories did not. Now, as your breath rises and falls like the tide beneath a moonlit harbor, let these echoes of Ottoman justice drift into dusk. The minarets stand tall still. The old courts are silent, but the names, some whispered in reverence, others in fear, linger like incense on silk. In our next tale, we shall enter the glittering courts and grimy alleys of Renaissance France, where justice dressed itself in finery, where dungeons lay beneath gilded halls, and where punishments could be elegant, eccentric, and edged with revolution. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. The shadows grew longer in the cobbled alleys of our imagined medieval town, and so too did the echoes of justice, harsh, peculiar, and wholly unforgiving. In the previous chapters, we wandered through streets haunted by the gibbet and marred by the whips of authority. Tonight, our path veers deeper into the forest of curious retribution, where logic was less a guiding principle and more a suggestion, easily lost in the bramble of fear and spectacle. Tonight, let us walk slowly through the tale of the shame masks, grotesque contraptions crafted not to harm the flesh, but to humiliate the spirit. The shame mask, or Schandmask, as it was known in parts of the Germanic lands, was no mere covering. It was a statement, a walking accusation. Forged from cold iron, these masks were heavy with mockery. Some bore the exaggerated features of animals, a pig's snout for the gluttonous, the gaping beak of a rooster for the gossip, or the long tongue of a serpent for the liar. Others were adorned with horns, ears stretched long, or eyes open far too wide, all meant to caricature the perceived sin of the wearer. But these were not worn in silence. The punishment demanded performance. Once affixed to the accused's face, often with iron clamps biting at the scalp and chin, the offender was paraded through the streets. Accompanied by the town crier or guards ringing bells and calling out the crime, the bearer of the mask became a living proclamation of shame. Townsfolk were encouraged, sometimes required, to jeer, mock, and even pelt the punished with old vegetables, stones, or waste. This was no mere embarrassment. It was a ritual of collective degradation. Consider, if you will, the tale of one Agnes the Weaver from a village nestled along the River Main. A widow and outspoken seller of linens, Agnes was known for her sharp tongue and bolder than was customary opinions. In a time and place where a woman's voice was meant to be soft and seldom, Agnes became a target. A rival, envious of her business and weary of her biting remarks, accused her of public scorn and the spreading of untrue tales. With little trial and less evidence, the ruling was swift, a shame mask, molded to resemble a beast with gnarled horns and grotesque jowls, and a week of public shaming. Agnes, though made of quiet steel, could not speak through the mask. It was designed that way. Some were fitted with tongue clamps or internal spikes that discouraged any utterance. For her, the weight of the iron was nothing compared to the weight of isolation. Children, once charmed by her colored cloths, now ran from her. Her stall was deserted, and she, in time, faded from village life entirely, her spirit worn away by the echo of laughter far crueler than silence. One might ask, what was the intent of such a punishment? To correct, perhaps. But more truthfully, it was to purge, to isolate, and to maintain a fragile social order built upon conformity and fear. The shame mask served as both punishment and warning. It told the community, this could be you. And in that whispered threat, obedience was more cheaply bought than with sword or stocks. Interestingly, these masks were not uniform. They varied by region, by offense, and even by the artisan who forged them. Some were artistic, almost theatrical, with painted details and movable jaws. Others were crude, slabs of rusted iron bent hastily into monstrous shape. In Italy, one mask might resemble a donkey, ears elongated in mockery of foolishness. In parts of Eastern Europe, a gaping maw might symbolize excessive chatter or drunkenness. The variety spoke to a common cultural urge, not merely to punish, but to brand, with image, with narrative, with myth. There existed even a mask known as the gossip's bridle, a cruel cousin of the shame mask, which forced an iron tongue plate deep into the mouth, rendering speech impossible and causing great pain should the wearer attempt to speak. The punishment was thus doubled, silence enforced, and shame broadcasted. Often, women, more than men, bore this device. It spoke to a time when speech, especially from the lips of those seen as lesser, was treated not as a right, but a sin. We might drift for a moment to the small town of Whitby, along the North Sea's harsh coast. Here the tale was told of a shipwright's daughter named Ellen, whose laughter could be heard even over the hammering of the docks. Ellen, bold and bright, caught the eye of many and the ire of a local magistrate's wife. Accused of inciting disorder with her lewd mirth and indecorous tales, Ellen was forced to wear a shame mask shaped like a twisted fox, its snout stretched forward, tongue protruding in a mockery of her supposed licentiousness. They say Ellen walked the whole of the harbor 3 times in that mask, her face red from rust and sun. But they also say she never cried, not once, that she walked as if she wore a crown. And some say that after her punishment, she left Whitby for the southern cities and became a singer of songs under another name. Whether true or just a tale told to comfort ourselves, Ellen's story lingers like the sea wind, bitter and strangely bracing. In the whispering quiet of this late hour, as candles tremble with sleep's approach, let us consider what these masks truly concealed. Not merely the identity of the punished, but the face of the society that made them. The face of fear disguised as order, of ridicule masquerading as justice, and of a world not so far removed from our own, where the urge to shame, to strip dignity under the pretense of moral good, still flickers in the darker corners. The shame masks have long since rusted into relics, yet their echoes, like so many stories of our medieval wanderings, remain, not to frighten, but to reflect, to remind us that the most curious punishments are not always the bloodiest, but those that seek to alter not the body, but the soul. And now, with hearts a little heavier and minds filled with iron faces and iron rules, let us rest. The fire dims, the wind softens, and sleep awaits, ever gentle. The hour grows late, and the ancient wind whispers once more, drawing us further down the winding path of strange justice. Tonight, we find ourselves far from bustling markets and echoing cathedrals. Instead, our journey leads us to a dim, soot-laced chamber of stone, where silence is broken not by cries, but by the scrape of metal upon bone. Here we linger upon one of the most enigmatic and haunting punishments of medieval discipline, the use of the iron chair. A thing of horror born not for speed but for spectacle, the iron chair was not always used as a tool of execution. No, its power lay in its symbolism, in its ability to terrify long before it ever embraced its victim. Crafted entirely from iron, its surface was embedded with sharp spikes, hundreds of them, covering the seat, the back, the armrests, even the footrest. Some chairs had mechanisms that could be tightened, pressing the flesh further into the spikes, ensuring every nerve felt the intimate cruelty of the iron's kiss. Imagine a chamber deep within the keep of a castle, or a manorial hall turned seat of judgment. Torches flicker, casting jagged shadows upon damp walls. A prisoner is led in, eyes hollow, legs trembling beneath chains. The iron chair waits, not as a thing of rage, but as an instrument of cold deliberation. Its very presence says, confess, and more often than not, it was confession that it sought. Not truth, but submission. One must understand that the iron chair was rarely fatal in the first hours of its application. It was designed to break the will, not end the life. The condemned would be stripped and seated, the spikes biting into flesh, yet not deep enough to kill. Straps would secure the limbs, and weight would do the rest. The agony was not in a single moment, but in the relentless pressure, the impossibility of shifting, the knowledge that every breath, every twitch drew blood. In certain regions, particularly within the Holy Roman Empire, the iron chair became a feared implement of interrogators. Priests and magistrates alike, cloaked in robes and righteous cause, would sit across from the accused, posing questions as though in polite conversation. Did you consort with devils? Did you steal from the church? Did you speak heresy? Each question, if met with silence, would be followed by a turn of the crank. A little more weight, a little more pressure, and the spikes would sink further into skin. One cannot help but feel the deep ache of helplessness in such a setting. The body is held in stillness, unable to flinch or flee, while the mind is caught between unbearable pain and the crushing guilt of knowing that the only escape is betrayal, of oneself, of others, or of a truth no longer relevant. Let us now drift to a case recorded in the town ledgers of Nuremberg, where a man named Tobias Schmidt once lived, a humble miller, known for his sharp wit and suspicion of local clerics. It was whispered that Tobias often scoffed at the relics paraded through town, that he refused to tithe with the same zeal as his neighbors. When a grain shortage struck and accusations flew, it was Tobias who found himself imprisoned, charged with withholding the bounty of God. Though he denied all wrongdoing, Tobias was brought before the iron chair. Witnesses later claimed he did not scream at first, that he sat rigid and pale, jaw clenched as the straps were tightened. But as the hours passed and the iron sank deeper, the strength of his silence gave way to moans, then cries, and finally a flood of words, confessions, names, stories perhaps true, perhaps imagined. What matters is that they were enough. Tobias was spared the noose, but he was never the same again. He walked with a limp until his death, and his voice, once clear and bold, became a whisper. The iron chair's use faded slowly, not out of mercy, but because its terror had already done the work. A whisper of its return was enough to still dissent. The chairs, many of them, were preserved in dark corners of city halls, not hidden, but displayed, to remind, to warn, to promise. Yet not all were so ornate. In smaller villages, where iron was scarce and craftsmanship modest, simpler versions emerged. Wooden chairs studded with nails, splinters soaked in old blood. These crude cousins lacked the prestige of their grander counterparts, but the pain they delivered was no less real. Justice, after all, did not require elegance, only obedience. And what of the watchers? For such punishments were rarely performed in secrecy. Public audiences were common, or at least common enough for word to spread. Children would grow up hearing tales of the chair in hushed tones, their minds shaped by fear long before they ever saw it. Parents would invoke its name as warning. Do not lie, or the chair will find you. And so, even those who never touched its iron grew up with its image etched into their souls. In truth, the iron chair was a mirror, reflecting not the crimes of those who sat upon it, but the fears of those who built it. The fear of rebellion, of chaos, of unapproved thoughts. It was a weapon of the status quo, as brutal in its purpose as it was in its construction. And like so many other devices of the time, it outlived its era in legend, if not in use. As we close our eyes tonight, imagining the cold weight of chains and the quiet horror of an unyielding seat, let us remember the lesson buried within the iron. That pain, however sharp, fades. But the memory of being powerless, the memory of sitting upon a throne of suffering while the world looks on, lingers long after the bruises heal. Sleep now, beneath softer covers than iron. Let the old winds carry these echoes far from your door as the past drifts once more into the hush of dreaming. The fire crackles low and the night deepens, drawing us once more into the strange theater of medieval justice, a place where fear was shaped into tools and punishment dressed in rituals both grim and bewildering. As we part the veils of time, let us now step into the chilling tale of the heretic's fork, a peculiar device that sought not blood, but the stillness of thought, the surrender of voice, and the silence of conviction. The heretic's fork, deceptively simple in its design, was a rod of iron no longer than a man's forearm. At each end of this rod, forks with sharp twin prongs pointing outward. One end was pressed just beneath the chin, the other at the base of the throat, or sometimes at the chest. Once in place, a leather collar and metal brace would hold the fork firm, forcing the wearer to hold their head upright in unnatural, agonizing stillness. A single movement, a nod, a whisper, a prayer, would drive the prongs into flesh. It was not designed to kill. No, the fork was the cruel child of interrogation, used primarily in the chambers of the Inquisition and other ecclesiastical courts. Its purpose was to keep the accused awake, to prevent the speaking of words deemed dangerous, incantations, confessions, pleas, or prayers not approved by the church. In this silence, the accused was meant to break. Sleep, denied. Speech, forbidden. Even the comfort of lowering the head in despair was transformed into a peril. Let us imagine for a moment the stone confines of a remote monastery turned tribunal. A man sits in robes once white, now stained with damp. His name is Father Odon, once a scholar of scripture, now accused of harboring thoughts too bold for his brethren. They say he read texts locked behind forbidden doors. They say he asked questions no one wished to answer. On the day of his arrest, he did not shout or plead. He merely stared ahead, hands clasped in prayer. But prayer, in this room, was no longer his right, and so the fork was brought forth. Bound at the neck and chest, its cruel points pressed against skin not yet broken, Father Odon was made to stand, for hours, then days. He could not lean, nor bow, nor close his eyes without sharp pain. And though the wounds were shallow, it was the weight of wakefulness that drew his sanity from him, thread by thread. No sleep, no speech, only silence, only fear. The heretic's fork had no grandeur. It bore no engravings, no polished steel. Its very lack of flourish made it all the more dreadful, for it whispered that suffering need not be loud nor adorned to be complete. Its terror lay in its restraint, how it punished the smallest of instincts, to sigh, to doze, to look away. Across Europe, similar forks appeared in different guises. In Spain, it was sometimes affixed with bells that would chime at the smallest movement, alerting a watching guard. In the Italian states, inscriptions were sometimes etched into the rod, phrases like ab heresy purificatis, purified from heresy. The irony was suffocating, for the fork purified nothing. It merely suppressed. And in that suppression, fear grew like mold on damp stone. One tale, passed down from the records of Toulouse, tells of a young scribe named Clara. She was clever, too clever perhaps. Accused of copying texts deemed apocryphal, she was brought before the Dominican fathers. When questioned, she answered truthfully and without shame, and so they deemed her defiance heresy, and the fork was brought. Clara wore it for 3 days. In that time, she neither spoke nor slept. When they removed it, they expected her to recant. Instead, she whispered one word, veritas, truth, and for that, she was sent away, further, into the depths of the inquisitorial prisons. Some say she lived writing in secret. Others say her name was scrubbed from the records, as if she had never existed. But the fork she wore is said to remain, kept behind glass, a reminder to all scribes to mind their words and their wonder. The heretic's fork reveals a particular cruelty of the age, the desire not to destroy the body, but to conquer the soul, to strip away not life, but belief. It was not a punishment of spectacle, but of control. For what greater power than to command not just a person's actions, but their silence? And yet, like so many instruments of fear, the fork's use waned as the tides of reason began to lap at the shores of tradition. As inquiry became less heretical and more human, the need for such devices grew harder to justify. Still, whispers of its use lingered into the early modern period, during dark times, in secret chambers, where fear had not yet been replaced by understanding. As we drift now into the calm of night, let us remember not just the fork's steel, but the stillness it imposed, the way it turned breath into danger, thought into peril. And let us carry forward the stories of those who endured it, who stood silent and trembling, not because they were guilty, but because they dared to speak too soon or too truly. Rest gently now, beneath softer pillows than iron. Let the stars keep watch, and may no silence ever come to you by force, but only by peace. The night is long but kind. Let it carry you away. The stars linger above like quiet sentinels, and the hush of midnight cloaks the land in velvet shadows. Tonight, our tale carries us to the edges of both reason and superstition, where punishment wore the mask of justice but bore the hands of cruelty. In this 15th part of our journey, we meet one of the most eerie practices in all of medieval jurisprudence, a punishment not delivered by sword or fire, but by water. Let us now descend into the chilling depths of the trial by ordeal of water. In an age when the boundary between law and religion blurred into mist, guilt was often proven not by evidence, but by ordeal, a trial handed not to men, but to God himself. The water ordeal was among the most favored, particularly when suspicion alone cast shadows on one's name. And though the ritual took many forms, its essence was dreadfully simple. The accused would be bound and cast into a body of water, usually a river, a well, or a deep basin, while priests or magistrates observed. What determined guilt? Not confession, not testimony, but whether the water accepted or rejected the soul. The reasoning behind it, twisted though it may seem now, was steeped in the symbolism of the sacred. Water was seen as a pure element, holy, incorruptible. If the water rejected the accused, if they floated, it meant their soul was so stained with sin that even the purity of water would not receive them. If they sank, it meant the water welcomed them, proving their innocence. And yet, if they did not rise again, innocence mattered little to the grave. Many trials of this nature were performed under the direction of local clergy, cloaked in Latin chants and ceremonial solemnity. The accused would be tied, often with rope or cloth, sometimes with a holy token placed upon their chest. They would be lowered slowly into the water, surrounded by villagers holding their breath, and judges whose hands held no mercy. What was meant to be divine revelation became, more often than not, a cruel gamble with life itself. Consider the village of Saint Alban in Normandy, where a young midwife named Isabeau once lived. Skilled and silent, she was known for her strange herbs and moonlit walks, and for many years she was tolerated, respected even, until a stillbirth in a noble family stirred suspicion. In a matter of days, whispers turned to accusations. The word witch was spoken not with fear but with relief, for once that word took root, blame had found its soil. Isabeau was bound at dawn, her arms crossed over her chest, her ankles tied with coarse hemp. A priest murmured blessings as she was led to the edge of a stone well, its water dark and impossibly still. Villagers gathered, the air heavy with anticipation and dread. As she was lowered, the rope slackened, slowly, deliberately. She floated. Her body, buoyed by tension and fate, did not sink. A gasp rose from the crowd. She was pulled back, sputtering, cold, and immediately condemned. The irony, of course, was that her buoyancy marked her as guilty. Within the hour, she was marched away to a cell where she would await a fate harsher than the water's embrace. Some say she was burned, others say she escaped. But the well remained, its waters ever dark, ever still, reflecting only the eyes of those who dared to watch. It must be said, this ordeal was not always fatal, nor always upheld. There were cases where the condemned survived, where influential allies intervened, or where public outcry stayed the hand of execution. But the logic behind the ordeal, its cruel paradox, remained firm. Float and be guilty. Sink and perhaps drown in innocence. In some towns, variations were practiced. A woman might be wrapped in a weighted cloak and lowered gently, her limbs bound but her face uncovered. If she floated upright, it was said the devil held her aloft. If she sank too quickly, it was seen as divine acceptance. And yet the line between judgment and survival was razor thin. Many who passed the ordeal did so only to face other forms of penance, a branding, a pilgrimage, a vow of silence. For once accused, the stain rarely washed away. Even men, though less often than women, were subjected to the trial. In Bohemia, a monk accused of heresy was thrown into the Vltava, only to float for several long minutes before being declared an agent of Satan. His books were burned and his monastery emptied. His name was never spoken again. It is a haunting thing to imagine standing at the edge of such a fate, to know that justice was not in truth, but in tides, that one's future rested not in the mind or the heart, but in the indifferent current of a well or river. The water did not care. It did not judge. But those who watched it certainly did. By the 13th century, the church began to retreat from such rituals, wary of the growing unease among thinkers and commoners alike. But the practice endured in isolated valleys and rigid communities, long after reason had begun to erode its foundations. And now, as the night wraps tighter about us, let us return to our own stillness. One without ropes, without chants, without wells. Let the darkness of the past drift away like leaves on a stream, and let peace settle in place of fear. For the waters of memory, though deep, cannot claim you here. Sleep gently, and may no current ever test your worth. The night watches kindly, and so do I. The night deepens, and the winds outside our chamber whisper of ancient truths, long buried beneath stone and silence. In this next chapter of our journey through the darker corridors of medieval justice, we step into a world where punishment was not merely endured, but displayed, where suffering was suspended, not by time or mercy, but by the twisted embrace of the cage of contempt. In many medieval towns and cities, it was not enough for justice to be served. It had to be seen. It had to linger in the memory of those who watched, like the toll of a cathedral bell after the sound has vanished. The gibbet cage, as it came to be known, was the ultimate symbol of this philosophy. Suspended from gallows, castle walls, or tall poles near city gates, these iron cages held not just the dead, but sometimes the living, stripped of dignity, exposed to the elements, and reduced to symbols of warning. Crafted from iron bands and rusted bars, the cage was shaped crudely to mimic the human form. Some were upright, like standing coffins, while others curled the body into unnatural contortions. Once placed inside, the condemned could not sit nor fully stand. They were left suspended, swinging in the wind, their every breath an act of defiance against time. Let us travel to a coastal town in Brittany, where the salty wind never rested and gulls circled the sky like omens. Here lived a thief named Jacques, a man known less for his crimes and more for his daring. He stole not out of greed, but out of pride, often leaving behind riddles and taunts. For a while, he became a folk hero of sorts. But in a world ruled by strict order, legends were dangerous. He was captured, tried, and sentenced not to death, but to be displayed. The cage was hung from the tallest watchtower overlooking the sea. Jacques, still alive, was shackled within. No food, no water, no shade. The townsfolk were told to watch him, to let the lessons sink into their bones. For 3 days and nights, he swayed above the cliffs, his voice slowly fading with each gust of wind. On the 4th morning, the gulls were all that remained. Such scenes were not uncommon. The cage was a punishment for traitors, highwaymen, pirates, and rebels. Those who threatened not just the laws, but the fragile peace of society. And while some were executed before being placed within, others were condemned to die slowly under the gaze of neighbors and strangers alike. In England, the practice came to grim prominence during the reign of Edward I. Bodies of poachers and highwaymen were left in cages near crossroads, where travelers could not avoid them. The smell, the sight, the slow rot, it was all part of the message. Here lies the fate of the disobedient. Do not forget. One such case was that of Elric of Thornmere, a young man who led a failed revolt against a corrupt baron. Captured after weeks in hiding, he was not given a trial, only a sentence. A cage was hung outside the baron's hall, and Elric was placed within, while still breathing. It was midwinter. Snow fell. His breath turned to mist each morning, thinner and thinner until it ceased. Yet long after, his bones remained, encased in frost and rust. There were whispers of mercy on occasion. A few priests, moved by pity, would bless the condemned from afar. A handful of villagers, under the cover of darkness, left bread or water near the base of the pole, though few could reach it. But mercy was rare. Fear, after all, was far more effective when left untouched. Some cages were designed to prolong the suffering. The raven cages of the Low Countries were known for their smaller size and tighter construction, causing deep bruising, restricted breathing, and eventual madness. The condemned were not always criminals in the true sense. Sometimes they were political enemies, rivals, or scapegoats. To the eye of power, disobedience wore many faces. The symbolism of the cage extended beyond death. It became a metaphor for public shame, for the stripping away of humanity. A person in a cage was no longer a man or woman, but a symbol of law, of consequence, of submission. And for every soul trapped within iron, 100 others walked a little straighter, spoke a little softer, obeyed a little faster. By the late medieval period, as cities grew and centralized laws replaced feudal whims, the use of the cage slowly faded. But it never vanished completely. Some towns, proud of their gruesome history, kept them on display, empty now, rusted, yet still filled with the invisible presence of those once held. A warning in silence. Even now, in certain places, remnants remain. Cages hang from forgotten towers or rest in museum shadows, too grotesque to display, too powerful to discard. They are relics of a time when fear did not hide behind laws, but stood in plain sight, ironclad and unblinking. And so as we close our eyes tonight, let the wind that once rocked those terrible cages pass us by. Let it whisper not of torment, but of the strength to remember. For though the cages are empty now, their echoes still drift through the corridors of history, asking us to look, to learn, and to never forget. Sleep now, unbound and unburdened. May your dreams be free and your rest untouched by iron. The night is watching, but gently, always gently. The hush of early morning lies over the landscape, as though the world itself is holding its breath. The moon, pale and unwavering, casts its silver light across silent rooftops and sleeping fields. And here, within this quiet hour, we continue our descent into the dim corners of medieval retribution, into a punishment crafted not from metal or flame, but from hunger, sorrow, and the slow withering of the human spirit. Tonight, we enter the story of the pillory, and the slow theater of shame it brought to every market square and chapel yard across the medieval world. Unlike the gallows or the rack, the pillory did not aim to kill. Its intention was subtler, yet no less cruel. It sought to fracture the soul by parading the body. A wooden frame, set upon a raised platform, it was designed with holes to trap the head and arms of the condemned. Once secured, the prisoner could not move, could not shield their face, could not escape the eyes of those who came to mock or spit or worse. The pillory stood most often at the heart of town, near the market, the church, or the steps of a lord's hall, where passers-by would be certain to witness the lesson. The offenses punished by it were not always grand: petty theft, cheating in trade, slander, or breaking the fast during Lent. But the punishment was always loud, even when the victim remained silent. Let us walk for a moment into the morning streets of Bruges, where the bells of St. Salvator's Cathedral are just beginning to stir. There, near the town square, a man named Willem the baker stands locked in the pillory. He is gaunt, his once proud apron now soiled and torn. His crime? They say he placed stones beneath the crusts of his loaves, selling them as whole. A deceit of hunger, born from desperation. As townsfolk begin their day, they pass by. Some laugh, some throw rotten fruit, others merely glance away. Children mimic his cries, while a few elders whisper that he had fed the orphan more than once. But compassion is quiet and punishment speaks louder. Willem's shame is not merely in pain, but in the erosion of dignity. He cannot shield his face from the sun, the cold, or the tears that fall not from fear, but from humiliation. The pillory could be endured for hours or days. Some were left exposed from dawn until sunset. Others remained overnight, vulnerable to all manner of weather and cruelty. It was not uncommon for the condemned to be physically harmed by onlookers, beaten, burned, or maimed under the guise of righteous anger. And though guards were sometimes posted, they were not always protectors. More often, they too jeered or turned their backs. In France, there lived a weaver's daughter named Alix, accused of sorcery for crafting garments said to bring unusual dreams. Whether the dreams were gentle or dark, no one could agree. But fear spread faster than fabric, and Alix was sentenced to the pillory for a full market day. Her long hair was shorn, her hands bound tightly within the wooden clasp. A sign above her read, Tisseuse de Malheur, weaver of misfortune. They say she did not cry, that she met each stare with quiet defiance. But when dusk fell and the crowds dispersed, Alix was no longer the same. She returned to her loom, but her hands trembled. Her voice never rose above a whisper again, and though she lived many years, she never left the village. For shame, once nailed into the memory of a place, is hard to untangle. Some towns devised crueler variations. In Florence, offenders were sometimes pilloried while wearing signs describing their crime, written in elaborate script so no one could pretend ignorance. In England, it was common to smear the face of the accused with tar or mud, so the humiliation would linger even after release. And in harsher winters, the wooden stocks became instruments of frostbite and fever, turning shame into suffering. But perhaps the most harrowing part of the pillory was its reliance on the crowd. It was not the frame itself that punished. It was the people. It was the willingness of neighbors, friends, and strangers to turn cruelty into entertainment, to forget mercy, to trade empathy for laughter. The pillory did not just break individuals. It revealed the fault lines in communities. By the late Middle Ages, the use of the pillory began to wane. Philosophers questioned its utility, and some towns dismantled their platforms altogether. Yet in many places, they remained well into the 17th century, preserved as reminders, as threats. And in the minds of those who suffered beneath them, the pillory never truly vanished. Even today, the word survives, transformed into metaphor, but still carrying its weight. To be pilloried is to be exposed, to be judged by the court of public opinion, where crowds still gather, though now in whispers and written word. So as we retreat into the softness of night, let us remember those who stood not for justice, but as its sacrifice. Let us hold in our hearts the memory of those whose worst crime was to stumble in a world with little patience for imperfection. Sleep now, beneath no gaze but that of the stars. May no voice rise to shame you, and may your dreams be filled with mercy, silent, boundless, and free. The pillory is empty now. Let it stay that way. The air grows still as the stars deepen above, and the world seems to rest on the edge of breath, as though even time itself has paused to listen. We walk now into the quieter, more insidious corners of medieval punishment, where cruelty was not always garbed in iron, but sometimes in ritual, in silence, in exile. In this 18th part of our tale, we explore the slow devastation of the walking penitence, a punishment that turned the road itself into a path of sorrow. Unlike the rack or the wheel or the burning stake, the walking penance did not spill blood. There were no ropes, no spikes, no blazing fires. But make no mistake, this was punishment in its most enduring form. It could last weeks or months or even years, and it transformed those who bore it into living warnings, walking relics of guilt beneath open sky. The condemned were often stripped of their station, their name, their voice in the community. A robe of coarse wool or linen would be given to them, plain, usually gray or white, and marked with a cross or a symbol of sin upon the back. Their heads were sometimes shaved, their feet left bare. They would be sent out from the town or city, not as travelers, but as visible reminders of transgression. And wherever they went, they were to walk, to pray, and to beg, not for alms, but for absolution. Let us journey for a time alongside such a figure, a man named Brother Gerard, once a monk of Saint-Ouen, whose voice was known to lift even the most burdened hearts. But one bitter winter, in a moment of desperation or defiance, Gerard broke his vow of poverty. It was said he sold church silver to feed the poor during a siege. Though many believed his act noble, the church deemed it theft, and so came his sentence, a walking penitence lasting 1 full year. He was given a robe, a wooden cross, and a route through Rouen, then south along the Seine, to Paris, Orleans, then into the valleys of Aquitaine. In every town, he was to kneel before the cathedral doors, to confess aloud, and to remain 3 days and nights outside, sleeping beneath the eaves, sustained only by what strangers might offer. His voice, once full of joy, turned to gravel. His hands, once warm in prayer, grew cracked with frost. Children laughed at him. Some wept. Others ignored him entirely. And though a few offered bread or blessing, the road was long and unforgiving. The soles of his feet bled. Wolves howled on cold nights, and yet he walked, step by step, beneath the burden of both shame and silence. These journeys were not reserved only for clergy. Common folk, too, were made to walk, those accused of adultery, blasphemy, or abandoning their duties. A woman named Beatrice of London, once a respected midwife, was seen attending to a birth during Lent without clerical permission. Her punishment was 3 months of walking between parishes, barefoot and fasting, her robe marked with the words, Femme de faute, woman of sin. She aged 10 years in that season, and though her body returned, her spirit remained somewhere along the path. The walking penance had roots in older traditions, a blend of Roman pilgrimage, Christian mortification, and folk beliefs about the healing power of long roads. But in the hands of authority, it became a weapon, slow and relentless. It demanded suffering not all at once, but in increments, measured out over distance and time. There were those who embraced it, in part. Men and women who had truly repented, who saw the journey as a chance to cleanse their hearts. They would walk with heads bowed, chanting prayers, carving blessings into tree bark, or leaving tokens at wayside shrines. But even for them, the toll was heavy. Not all returned. Many died along the roads, of illness, hunger, or despair. And in death, their sins were sometimes considered only half forgiven. In some towns, the arrival of a penitent was marked by silence. No one would speak to them. They were to be seen but not acknowledged, like ghosts. And in other places, they were forced to bear burdens along the way, stones upon their back, or a cross of wood to drag behind. These additions turned their movement into a sort of passion play, reenacting the suffering of Christ, though without his promise of resurrection. Yet the cruelest truth of the walking penance was this: there was no guarantee of restoration. Even after the sentence ended, the shame often lingered. Neighbors remembered. Employers turned them away. The robe could be removed, but the reputation was harder to shed. Still, there are stories, rare, whispered, of penitents who found peace. A tanner named Ewald, who walked from Cologne to Rome as penance for a brawl that ended in a man's death, later became a healer along the route, tending to the sick at roadside inns. A young woman from Aragon, accused of breaking her betrothal vow, returned years later as a scribe, her words soft but unbroken. These were not triumphs, but quiet survivals. And sometimes that was enough. As we lie still beneath blankets softer than sackcloth, let us remember those who walked not for pilgrimage or discovery, but because justice demanded it. Their journey was not of wonder, but of endurance. And each step they took was a testament, not to guilt, but to the unbearable resilience of the human soul. May your path tonight be easier. May your dreams be of warmth and welcome, of hearts that do not judge, and roads that do not punish. Sleep now, and may the only journey you take be one that carries you gently into the arms of peace. The hush before dawn settles softly, and the flicker of candlelight dances across the stone walls of memory. We continue now into the waning embers of our tale, and as our path grows narrower, we turn our eyes toward a punishment at once quiet and devastating, designed not to wound the flesh, but to unmake the very place a person called home. This was exile, or as it was sometimes known in the cloistered corners of the medieval world, banishment, the casting out, not of sinners from salvation, but of men and women from the lands that once shaped their lives. To be exiled in the medieval age was no light matter. It was not merely to be told to leave, but to become nameless in the eyes of the community, to be severed from hearth and kin, to vanish from law and protection. It was a sentence often reserved for crimes deemed serious but not mortal, such as treason without bloodshed, repeated heresy, or the breaking of solemn oaths. Yet, at times, it was handed down for reasons far more arbitrary: politics, jealousy, or the shifting tides of favor in a lord's court. Picture, if you will, the low hills of Devonshire, where a knight named Aldrich once held a modest fief and the quiet respect of his neighbors. He had fought for his liege, paid his tithes, and ruled his small lands with a gentle hand. But the world of courts and whispers is treacherous. A rival, covetous of Aldrich's holdings, accused him of treason, claiming false letters forged with skill as proof. Though no blade was drawn and no plot unveiled, the verdict was swift: banishment for life, under pain of death should he return. On the morning of his sentence, Aldrich stood upon the village green, unarmed, unarmored, wrapped in a cloak he had worn since youth. His wife wept silently beside him. His children, too young to understand, clutched at his legs. But law had spoken. He was given a day's travel and a prayer, no more. And so he turned from all he had known, becoming a stranger to the very soil that had once been his. Exile stripped a person of all identity. Property was seized, names were struck from records, and no man might offer aid without risking punishment himself. Those cast out became wanderers, sometimes fugitives, sometimes pilgrims, often ghosts in the eyes of those who remained behind. In ecclesiastical law, excommunication and exile were often entwined. A soul condemned by the church might find no refuge within city walls. Monasteries would not open their doors. Markets would not trade. Even burial in consecrated ground could be denied. And so the exiled lived a twilight life, not quite dead, yet not permitted among the living. Consider the fate of Agnes of Würzburg, a scholar and scribe, accused of translating forbidden texts and questioning the provenance of relics held by the bishopric. Her exile was spiritual and physical. She was exiled not only from the town, but from every church within 50 leagues. Her books were burned, her workshop dismantled. She fled into the forested edges of Bavaria, where she survived for years by copying texts in secret, hiding her name behind invented authors, her thoughts wrapped in riddles and allegory. And then there were those who welcomed exile, who chose it as a kind of penance. Monks who broke their vows, knights who failed in battle, lovers whose union had drawn blood. They walked away from their birthplaces not in shame, but in sorrow, seeking redemption in the unknown. Some found it, some did not. A curious form of temporary exile also existed, the truce of God exile. In times of intense conflict, a person might be sentenced to a pilgrimage, not as a religious act, but as a legal banishment. They were sent, under threat of death, to journey to a holy site, Jerusalem, Santiago, Canterbury, and not return until certain terms had been met. Along the road, they wore symbols of their status, often a scallop shell or a colored cross, marking them as both penitent and cast out. But not all exiles wandered far. In some cities, a person might be sentenced to remain outside the walls for a season, camped in the fields, their home just within sight, but unreachable. Such punishments were cruel in their closeness, allowing the condemned to hear the bells, smell the bread, and yet never pass through the gates. Some of these souls were given the hope of return. If they could find an advocate, if they could prove their innocence, if the winds of fortune shifted. But for most, exile was a slow unraveling, a life spent rebuilding, name by name, in a land that would never be theirs. Even centuries later, in the early records of the Renaissance, towns maintained books of the banished, names carefully scribed with the date of their departure, the crime, and a space left blank for return. Most of those spaces were never filled. Exile reminds us that the worst punishments are not always violent. To be severed from belonging, to lose not only one's place but the recognition of one's existence, that is a wound deeper than blade or flame. It was and remains a punishment not just of the body but of the soul. Now, as you settle into the safety of familiar walls, let your breath fall softly. You are not cast out. You are not forgotten. Let the ache of those lost voices guide you only to compassion and not to fear. Sleep now, and dream not of doors closed, but of hearts always open and names always remembered. The road may be long, but tonight it leads you home. The sky before dawn is a muted gray, like vellum left too long in the cold. In this hour of hushed memory, we draw near the end of our long passage through the strangest corners of medieval punishment. And yet, tonight's chapter offers not a tale of flesh torn or voices silenced, but rather a glimpse into the ways power cloaked itself in performance, how punishment became theater, and justice a matter of spectacle. We now step into the curious domain of the shadowy, a ritual of noise, mockery, and public shame. Shadowy, sometimes called skimmington, was not decreed from a royal court, nor handed down by a bishop's seal. It was instead a punishment of the people, born in alleys and hearthfires, nurtured in gossip, and brought to life in banging pots and howling voices. Though it bore no laws, it held great power. For once a community decided to call forth a shadowy, no one, not lords, not priests, not queens, was spared. Its targets were varied, but its purpose was singular: correction through ridicule. A man who beat his wife, a woman who married too soon after her husband's death, a widow who took a lover deemed too young, a couple who defied custom or expectation. Even those who dared live too loudly or too differently could find themselves at the center of the cacophony. Imagine, if you will, a narrow street in a Flemish town. The houses lean inward, and the smell of bread and horses lingers in the air. It is near twilight, and suddenly the quiet shatters. A procession of villagers emerges, some masked, some draped in rags, all bearing drums, pans, bells, and horns. At their center, two figures ride a wooden donkey backward, their faces painted with soot and their heads hung low. This is no wedding, nor festival. This is a charivari, and the condemned are a couple, married in haste, perhaps, or caught in adultery, or merely disliked. The crowd chants crude rhymes, their laughter sharp. Effigies are waved in the air, mock images of the couple, sometimes carved or sewn grotesquely. Children run ahead, shouting their names. The noise is deafening, relentless. The message, you have erred and we have noticed. In the English shires, the practice was called rough music, a fitting name, for its rhythm was chaos. In France, charivari echoed through both countryside and town. In the German lands, similar rites were known as Katzenmusik, or cat music. Not because it pleased, but because it scratched. And while the form varied, the heart of it remained unchanged, to humiliate, to isolate, to correct. One of the most well-known cases comes from the court records of Lyon, where a wealthy merchant, Etienne, took a second wife just weeks after his first passed. The woman was young, too young, said the town, and so, on the eve of their wedding, the charivari began. They were paraded through the city in a cart filled with bones and turnips. The new bride wore a paper crown, the groom a cloak of feathers. A mock priest blessed them with mud. The laughter rang through the streets like judgment. But not all charivaris were so grand. In rural villages, a lone drummer might appear outside someone's door, banging until dawn. Stones might be thrown at shutters. Straw dolls hung from the eaves. The silence of neighbors would follow, the unspoken excommunication of shame. And in some cases, it was enough to drive families away, to end marriages, to ruin reputations for generations. What makes the charivari so fascinating and so chilling is its informality. It existed outside the bounds of law, yet wielded an authority the court sometimes could not match. And the line between tradition and cruelty was dangerously thin. For every charivari that scolded true wrongdoing, there was another driven by spite, jealousy, or fear of change. A woman too independent, a man too gentle, a marriage that challenged the norms of the village. All were targets. There were voices, even then, who questioned the practice. Clerics warned against the sin of mockery. Lords feared the crowd's power. In some places, charivaris were banned outright, though enforcement was rare. How does one silence 1,000 hands banging pots in the night? How does one jail laughter, or the echo of shame? And yet, despite its roots in ridicule, some charivaris held the echo of something older, something ritualistic. Anthropologists would later note its resemblance to rites of passage, to community cleansing, even to carnival. There was a rhythm, a pattern, a script. It was not justice in the legal sense, but a kind of collective reckoning. Twisted, yes, but deeply human. As the centuries turned, the charivari began to fade. The rise of centralized power, printed laws, and more formal courts left less room for the unruly theater of public scorn. But the instinct behind it, the need to shame, to police behavior through spectacle, did not vanish. It merely changed form. And so, in the quiet of your room, beneath covers untouched by soot or song, consider this. The worst punishments are not always decreed from thrones or altars. Sometimes, they are whispered from door to door, carried on laughter that cuts, or stares that never meet the eyes. Tonight, you are safe from such noise. There is no charivari here, only stillness, only gentleness. Let your name rest softly on your pillow. Let no crowd follow you into sleep. Dream now not of scorn, but of kindness, the kind that stays silent when silence is grace, the kind that watches but never wounds. Let the noise pass by and drift at last into peace. The night draws near its deepest hour, where time itself seems to slow and the very air is thick with stillness. Our journey through the most peculiar and poetic punishments of the medieval age now approaches its final curves. And tonight, we come to one of the strangest and most theatrical of all, a punishment that sought to unman, unmask, and undo through absurdity and spectacle. In this penultimate chapter, we find ourselves before the wooden eyes of the donkey cart and the quiet tragedy behind its laughter. The punishment of being paraded on a donkey, or in some cases a wooden frame made to resemble one, was used not for the gravest crimes, but for those that danced along the edges of social failure. Humiliation, cowardice, marital discord, or the violation of unspoken roles. It was a punishment that struck not at the body, but at pride, dignity, and place within the hierarchy of community. The accused would be mounted backward on the beast, so that his face met the scorn of the crowd. Often his clothes were turned inside out, or removed entirely. A fool's cap might be placed upon his head, or a garland of nettles and straw woven into a mock crown. His hands might be bound or forced to carry symbols of his shame, a wooden spoon for the lazy, a broken sword for the coward, or a spinning distaff for the unmanly. In some regions of France, this punishment was known as riding the ass of shame. It was reserved for those who had failed in their duties as husbands, for young men who fled battle, or for anyone who had made a public disgrace of themselves in the eyes of their neighbors. The journey was slow, deliberate, and accompanied by jeers, songs, and always the laughter of the crowd. Let us follow one such procession, winding its way through the narrow lanes of a Provençal village where the sun is high and the stones beneath the hooves of the donkey are warm and ancient. The man upon its back is Pierre, a tailor by trade, accused not of theft or heresy, but of striking his wife during a quarrel. She, a fierce and respected woman, had gone straight to the village elders, and though she bore no visible wounds, her voice was enough. The punishment was swift. Pierre was dressed in a shift of yellow linen and made to carry a branch of thorns. Children were told to follow and sing a rhyme, one that had been passed down for generations. Old women watched from balconies, some cackling, others solemn. The donkey moved slowly, its ears twitching at the noise, and Pierre, stripped of authority, stared at the dust before him, each step a slow surrender to public judgment. These rides were not always so kind. In many places, the parade ended in a whipping or a forced oath before the chapel doors. In others, the ride itself was so long and grueling that the condemned collapsed from heat and shame. And in some cases, it was not a donkey at all, but a wooden frame, crudely shaped, unstable, sharp at the edges, upon which the accused was forced to balance for hours, their legs bruised, their spine twisted with pain. In the borderlands between Italy and the Holy Roman Empire, such frames were called the iron horse, and were sometimes equipped with spikes or sharp ridges. Though lacking the levity of a live animal, these devices were used with even more cruelty. Soldiers accused of desertion or men deemed unfaithful were made to sit astride them until their groin and thighs bled. It was meant to emasculate, to humiliate, to turn strength into ridicule. But perhaps what makes this punishment so peculiar, so uniquely medieval, is its reliance on inversion. Everything was turned upside down. The rider faced backward. The noble made ridiculous. The serious reduced to buffoonery. It was not merely a sentence, it was a farce. And in that farce lay something deeper. A societal yearning not just for justice, but for performance, for balance, for ritual humiliation as a means of reasserting order. There are records, too, of women riding the donkey cart, not often, but memorably. Wives accused of infidelity or of wearing the trousers in the household were sometimes punished in the same way. In such cases, they were given wooden beards, or forced to ride beside effigies of their husbands, crafted with exaggerated features and floppy limbs. The message was clear: know your place, or we will unmake it for you. These punishments were often decided not by lords, but by town councils, guilds, or even informal assemblies of neighbors. They were tools of folk justice, ancient and hard to control, and sometimes they spun out of hand. There are tales of such processions turning violent, of men and women beaten or driven from their homes, never to return. But just as often, the punishment passed like a storm. A few hours of shame, a walk of sorrow and spectacle, and then silence. The donkey returned to its stable, the crowd returned to their chores, and the condemned returned home changed. Some bore the punishment with stoic silence. Others laughed through it, turning the spectacle into defiance. And a few, broken by it, left the town forever, seeking a place where no one had seen them with their head twisted backward and their pride laid bare. Now, centuries later, the image of the backward rider remains, odd, almost comic, and yet strangely haunting. It reminds us how deeply we fear ridicule, how much we value place, and how fragile our roles can be when the world decides to flip them, even for a day. So let us lie still now, with our feet forward and our heads unbowed. Let no donkey carry you tonight. Let no laughter chase you in dreams. The village is quiet, the roads are empty, and shame has no voice here. Sleep gently as you are, whole, upright, unseen. The ride is over. The night is yours. The night nears its final breath, and the world lies still, cloaked in the deepest shades of silence. This final chapter, Our 20-second step through the long corridor of medieval punishments brings us to the quietest, the darkest, and perhaps the most terrifying fate of all. Not a punishment of blood, nor of public shame, nor even of physical torment in the usual sense. No. Tonight we descend into the oubliette, the place of forgetting. Its name, oubliette, comes from the Old French oublier, meaning to forget. And indeed, that is its purpose. More than a prison, more than a cell, it is an erasure. A hole in the ground, narrow and deep, often with no door but a trap above, no ladder, no stairs, no voice to call your name once you are lowered in. It is the embodiment of oblivion, designed not to end a life swiftly, but to let it fade, unseen and unheard, until it dissolves into nothingness. Unlike the grand punishments designed to inspire fear or obedience, the oubliette was a punishment meant to be hidden. There were no crowds, no witnesses, no declarations. The condemned simply vanished. They were taken from the halls of power, the streets of the town, the whispers of their neighbors, and dropped into silence. Imagine the descent. The iron grate creaks open above, a faint shaft of light piercing the gloom. The condemned is lowered, or sometimes thrown into the pit. The fall is short, but enough to bruise. The floor is stone, damp and slick, sometimes littered with bones, with rats, with moss that weeps cold drops of water. The walls are too close to stretch your arms, the ceiling too high to reach. And then the grate closes. The light is gone. The oubliette was not always used for criminals in the common sense. It held heretics, traitors, political rivals, those whose existence was inconvenient to the powerful. In some castles, it was used for rebellious knights. In others, for priests who questioned too loudly. In others still, for wives who knew too much. It was the punishment of silence, for those who needed not to suffer, but to disappear. Let us walk now, not on the earth above, but far below, into the long-forgotten oubliette beneath the Château de Noirfleurs, a fortress in the borderlands between France and the old Duchy of Savoy. Beneath its south tower lay a shaft no wider than a man's shoulders, hidden beneath a false stone in the floor. Those cast into it could not lie down, nor stand straight. They crouched in eternal twilight, hearing only the breath of the earth, the scurry of vermin, the drip of unseen water. One such soul was Lady Iselda, a noblewoman accused of conspiring with a rival house to overthrow her brother, the Baron. She was never tried, never formally accused. One night she vanished from her chambers. Her servants whispered of a scream behind the wall, but no one dared speak further. Centuries later, during repairs to the old castle floor, a mason uncovered the hidden pit. At its bottom, a rusted ring of gold, a shred of velvet, no bones, no name. Food, when provided, was rare, often a crust tossed down or a small bucket lowered on a fraying rope. Water was gathered from the stones, if it gathered at all. Time lost meaning. Those who remained alive long enough to be removed often did so in madness, pale, blind, and muttering to themselves in languages they no longer recognized. In certain monasteries, a similar punishment existed, not as death, but as purification. A monk who transgressed beyond forgiveness might be cast into an inner cell without windows or words, a spiritual oubliette. He would be given bread and water once a day, and permitted no speech, no prayer allowed, no human contact. Some emerged months later, thin as shadows. Others never returned. Even more curious were the legends of the living tomb, an oubliette used for the worst of traitors. In these, the condemned was bricked inside, a space no larger than a coffin, but vertical. There the stone was sealed up behind them, and the world continued, never marking the grave, never mourning. In a few rare records from the Iberian Peninsula, such chambers were inscribed with curses, warding signs to keep the restless spirit trapped within the walls. And yet, for all its horror, the oubliette was used sparingly. It was not cheap, nor easy to hide. It was reserved for enemies of power so dangerous or so inconvenient that even execution would not suffice. Death could make a martyr. But disappearance? Disappearance left no song, no shrine, only doubt. What makes the oubliette so dreadful is not just the darkness, but the silence. It is the place where the world pretends you never were. No records, no tombstone, no mention in the prayers of the faithful. It is to be swallowed by stone and digested slowly by time. Today, many oubliettes have been filled in or closed, but some remain, buried in forgotten towers or behind rusted gates in damp cellars. Tour guides speak of them in low voices, Travelers peer down into the narrow holes and wonder. But none stay long. The air down there is too still, the darkness too complete. And so we close our long tale of punishment, not with fire or gallows, but with silence. For in the oubliette lies the most terrible truth of all, that sometimes, to punish a soul, all you must do is let it be forgotten. But you, dear listener, are not forgotten. Your voice matters. Your presence matters. Let the shadows of the past remain shadows and walk freely in the light of your own name. Now sleep gently and fully. Let the earth cradle you in safety, not in stone. Let your dreams echo with soft voices, not silence. The oubliette is sealed behind us. The past is done, and the dawn at last begins to rise.